The bulldozer was already idling at the edge of my great-grandfather's orchard when Denise Calloway climbed out of her white Range Rover, clipboard in hand, 4-inch heels sinking into the same dirt my family had worked since 1809. "This orchard is a liability to the community, Mr. Kessler," she said, tapping that clipboard against her tailored blazer like it was a gavel. The board voted, "It's over." 46 homes stood behind her, quiet in the morning heat. A $3.4 million HOA reserve fund sat somewhere in an account she controlled. And in her hand was a foreclosure notice claiming I owed $12,400 in delinquent assessments I had never once been billed for. By the end of that summer, Denise Calloway would lose her house, her Range Rover, and her freedom. And the strangest part, not $1 of what she'd owe would come from a courtroom fight over pecan trees. She didn't know it yet, nobody in Comfort Creek Estates knew it yet, but the very paperwork she was waving in my face that morning would end up crossing my desk. Because in a life she knew nothing about, I was the one who approved it. She just didn't know which Kessler she was dealing with. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 67 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, most of my neighbors thought I was just the quiet old man who grew pecans on the last 12 acres that hadn't been sold off to developers. That orchard was planted by my great-grandfather, Elias Kessler, in 1899, back when this whole stretch of Comfort Creek was scrub brush and cattle trails. He built the farmhouse with his own hands, and the kitchen table inside it, the one I still eat breakfast on, came out of the same oak tree he cleared to make room for the first row of saplings. My grandfather is buried under the biggest tree in the north row, my father's beside him. My wife, Carol, rests under the third. Every October, the whole orchard smells like split husks and diesel from the shaker machine. And every spring, it smells like rain on turned soil. I know every tree by feel in the dark. That land isn't property to me. It's the only place my whole family ever agreed on. Denise Calloway, on the other hand, had been HOA president for 6 years, and in that time she turned Comfort Creek Estates from a modest little subdivision into her personal kingdom. She drove a Range Rover she couldn't have afforded on her real estate commissions alone. She wore blazers that cost more than my truck payment. She carried that clipboard everywhere, like paperwork made her untouchable. What nobody in the neighborhood knew yet was that Denise had a silent partner, a developer named Grant Voss from a company called Portico Development Group who'd been circling my orchard for 2 years, waiting for an opening. That Tuesday she found one, or thought she had. I remember the exact time the notice arrived because I've learned over 67 years that exact times matter. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in April when the certified letter hit my mailbox. Comfort Creek Homeowners Association, Notice of Assessment Delinquency and Lien Filing. Amount owed, $12,400. Property subject to foreclosure sale within 30 days pursuant to the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. I read it twice standing right there at the end of my driveway. Cicadas going in the trees, the smell of cut grass drifting over from somebody's mower. Then I read it a third time slower. I had never received a single assessment invoice. Not one. In 30 years of paying my dues by check, mailed every January, I had never once been late. But there it was in black and white, a lien backed by a notice of board resolution, signed by Denise Calloway as president, and co-signed by a name I didn't recognize from something called Sabinal Trust Lending, listed as the association's authorized financial partner. I didn't call a lawyer that day, I didn't call anybody. I went inside, poured myself a glass of tea, and got out a legal pad. I wrote down the date, the time, every word on that letter. Then I drove to the county clerk's office and pulled copies of every HOA filing on record for Comfort Creek Estates going back 6 years. I photographed the mailbox, the letter, the postmark. I opened a folder, plain manila, nothing fancy, and I started keeping receipts, because that's what a man does when somebody's trying to take something from him quietly. He gets loud on paper, even while he stays quiet in person. 3 days later, Denise showed up at my gate with 2 men in polo shirts wearing lanyards that said Portico Development Group. That's when she told me the orchard was a liability. That's when I said almost nothing back, just, "You'll want to double-check those assessment records, ma'am," and shut the gate. She smiled at me like I was a slow child. "The board already voted, Mr. Kessler. This is happening whether you understand it or not." I understood plenty. I just didn't say so yet. Here's what most homeowners don't know. Under Texas Property Code Section 209.0092, an HOA cannot foreclose on a homestead exemption property for assessment liens without following strict notice and cure procedures, including written notice sent by certified mail to the actual owner of record, not a general P.O. box. My letter had gone to a P.O. box the association had listed for me, one I had closed 4 years earlier. That wasn't sloppy, that was deliberate. I spent the next 2 weeks doing what I do best, watching, waiting, writing things down. The first real break came from an old friend, Dale Pruitt, who'd worked 30 years in county recording and still had coffee with me every Thursday. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Sabinal Trust Lending, the authorized financial partner on my foreclosure notice, had filed articles of formation only 14 months earlier. A brand new shell, formed right around the time Denise Callaway became president for her second term. I pulled the corporate filing myself. Registered agent, a P.O. box in Austin. Officers, blank, except for a single name buried in the formation documents as manager, Grant A. Voss. Same Voss who ran Portico Development Group. Same man who'd been trying to buy my orchard for 2 years, quietly, through 3 different agents, each time getting turned down. I sat at that same kitchen table my great-grandfather built, and I laid it out on butcher paper like a crime scene, because that's what it was. Denise Callaway wasn't just harassing an old farmer over pecans. She was running assessment money through a shell company she and her developer partner controlled, using fake liens to seize land the HOA didn't actually have legal standing to touch. My property predated the covenants entirely, since my great-grandfather's deed was recorded in 1899, decades before Comfort Creek Estates existed as a legal entity in 1987. That was my small shield, sitting quiet in a drawer nobody had bothered to open. The original covenants had never been signed onto my parcel at all. Any fine against me was worthless paper. But the shield wasn't the story, the money was. Digging through 6 years of HOA financial disclosures, public record, filed with the state, most residents never read them, I found the reserve fund. $3.4 million, built up over a decade from assessments, meant for road repair and drainage. In the last 18 months, more than $780,000 of it had been transferred to Sabinal Trust Lending in 3 payments, each one logged as Consulting and Appraisal Services Orchard Acquisition Project. Denise wasn't taking my land because she hated pecans. She was laundering reserve money through a fake foreclosure so she and Voss could resell my 12 acres. Plus, I'd learn later, 3 more lots quietly seized from other long-time owners to Portico Development Group for a resale deal worth millions, with that $780,000 as her personal cut. That's when I met Dorothy Sablatora. Dot, everybody called her. 78 years old, widow of a Korean War veteran, oxygen tank rolling behind her on its little cart, living in the smallest house on Comfort Creek Lane. She flagged me down outside the feed store, wheezing, waving a letter of her own, a $3,200 special assessment for a drainage project that, as far as either of us could tell, had never actually happened. They told me if I didn't pay, they'd put a lien on Harold's house, she said, and her voice cracked on his name, even 11 years after he'd passed. I don't have $3,200, Walter. I don't have $300. I looked at her letter. Same handwriting on the board approval line, same shell company listed as financial partner. I folded my own foreclosure notice back into my jacket pocket and told her the same thing I'd have wanted somebody to tell me. Don't pay them a dime, Dot, I said. Not yet. I think I know something they don't. The bulldozer came back on a Thursday morning, and this time it didn't wait for permission. I was in the north row, checking graft lines on a young tree my father had planted the year before he died, when I heard the engine. By the time I got to the gate, the chain, the one that had held for 60 years, was already cut, bolt cutters still lying in the dirt where the operator had dropped them. Denise Calloway stood behind the machine in a cream-coloured blazer, filming the whole thing on her phone like she was documenting a home renovation show. Comfort Creek Homeowners Association versus 12 acres of code violations, she said into the camera, smiling. Let's clean this place up. She didn't know I was filming too, from the porch, on a camera I'd mounted the week before, the kind ranchers use to watch calving pastures at night. Every second of that bulldozer rolling onto land my great-grandfather cleared by hand in 1899 went straight to a hard drive, time-stamped, backed up in 3 places. I didn't run out shouting. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line, gave the dispatcher my address, and said, calmly, there's a bulldozer committing criminal trespass and property destruction on private land not subject to HOA jurisdiction. I have it on video. Please send a deputy when convenient. Then I called Dale Pruitt, and Dale called a reporter he knew at the Comfort Creek Gazette, a young woman named Priya Anand who'd been sniffing around the HOA's finances for months without much luck. 2 days later, Denise went after Dot. She sent a citation for Dot's wheelchair ramp, built by Harold himself 20 years earlier, perfectly legal, calling it a structural hazard with a $500 a day fine attached and a 72-hour compliance window. 72 hours to tear down a ramp a 78-year-old widow needed to get her oxygen tank in and out of her own house or face foreclosure. Dot called me crying. They're going to take Harold's house, Walter, over a ramp he built with his own hands. That was the moment I stopped being patient and started being precise. I already had the shell company paperwork. I already had the reserve fund transfers. I already had 2 weeks of trespass footage and a folder of certified mail receipts an inch thick. What I needed now was timing and witnesses who couldn't be dismissed as a bitter old farmer with a grudge. I called my attorney, not the folksy one who handled my will, but Marian Castellanos, who'd spent 20 years in banking compliance before going into private practice. I told her everything. She went quiet on the phone for a long moment. Walter, she said finally, do you understand what you're actually sitting on here? I told her I did. My family, through a holding company my grandfather built in the 1950s and I'd quietly run for 30 years, mostly through trustees and a name that meant nothing to anyone in Comfort Creek, held the original construction loan and, through a correspondent servicing agreement, still carried the note on the majority of mortgages in that subdivision, 41 of the 46 homes. I had known it for years, the way you know a fact about weather patterns you never expect to need. I had never once used it, because I never had a reason to. Now I did. Marian filed for an emergency temporary restraining order against the HOA and Sabinal Trust lending under Texas Property Code Section 209.0092, citing the invalid lien and the trespass. She sent formal notice to the county, permits, easement records, everything, establishing on paper, in advance, exactly what would happen and when. I wanted a sheriff's deputy present. I wanted a county inspector present. I wanted Priya Anand present with a camera. I wanted all of it, legal, documented, and impossible to spin. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 6 p.m., same time it always was. I made sure Marian had one phone call ready to make the moment I gave the word, a call to the loan servicing department of a company most people in that room had never heard of, informing 46 households, all at once, exactly who held their mortgages and exactly what had just happened to their reserve fund. I put on a clean shirt and I went to that meeting. The Comfort Creek Estates clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and new carpet glue, and every folding chair in the room was full. Denise Calloway sat at the head table in a peach blazer, clipboard squared in front of her, gavel resting beside it like she'd bought it at a costume shop. Grant Voss sat 2 seats down, silent, in a suit that didn't belong in a room with beige walls and a popcorn ceiling. Old business, Denise said, tapping her pen. The Kessler property matter is resolved. Demolition begins Friday. Actually, I said, standing, I'd like to raise a point of order. She smiled, that same slow smile from the driveway. Mr. Kessler, this isn't the venue for… It's exactly the venue. I set a folder on the table. Inside it, the shell company filing, the $780,000 in reserve transfers, the trespass footage stamped with time codes, and a letter from the Texas Real Estate Commission acknowledging receipt of a formal complaint. Behind me, the double doors opened, and a sheriff's deputy stepped in, along with a county code inspector and Priya Anand, notebook already out. Denise's smile didn't move, but her hand did, just slightly, toward the phone in her blazer pocket. Before anyone touches that gavel, I said, I need to make a call. I dialed Marion, put it on speaker, right there in front of 46 households. This is Marion Castellanos on behalf of Rio Kessler Holdings, she said, voice steady and carrying through the room's cheap speakers. As of this evening, notice has been sent to all mortgage holders in Comfort Creek Estates whose loans are serviced under our holding company. That includes 41 of the 46 homes in this subdivision and Ms. Calloway's residence at 214 Sabinal Court. The room went dead silent, except for somebody's chair creaking. Additionally, meeting continued, due to material fraud discovered in the HOA's reserve fund management, specifically transfers to a Shells entity, Sabinal Trust Lending, controlled by Ms. Calloway and Mr. Grant Voss, we're exercising our contractual right to audit and, where applicable, accelerate. Denise stood up so fast her chair scraped backward across the floor. This is insane! You don't have standing! Ma'am, the deputy said, stepping forward, I've got a signed complaint here for criminal trespass, destruction of property, and a fraud referral from the district attorney's office. I'm going to need you to step away from the table. The clipboard hit the carpet. Nobody in that room moved to pick it up. Grant Voss made it 3 steps toward the exit before the second deputy stopped him at the door. They put the cuffs on Denise Calloway in front of the same neighbors she'd fined, threatened, and lied to for 6 years, under the same fluorescent lights where she'd smiled and said, "The board already voted." Priya Anand got the whole thing on camera, and the video ran statewide within a week. 6 months later, Denise Calloway pleaded guilty to felony theft over $300,000 and securities fraud tied to the fake appraisal scheme. The court ordered $2.1 million in restitution to the Comfort Creek Reserve Fund, on top of forfeiting her house, her Range Rover, and every asset traceable to the $780,000 kickback. She's serving 11 years at a state facility outside Gatesville. Grant Voss took a plea deal, 3 years, cooperation in exchange for testimony, and Portico Development Group dissolved within the year, its remaining assets seized to help cover the $3.4 million reserve shortfall. Sabinal Trust Lending was dissolved by court order, its bank accounts frozen and returned to the association. The invalid lien against my orchard was voided in driving, with the court specifically citing that my parcel's 1899 deed predated the 1987 covenants and had never been legally subject to them. My grandfather's quiet oversight, the one nobody ever thought mattered, turned out to matter most. Rio Kessler Holdings didn't foreclose on a single home. That was never the point. Instead, we restructured 41 mortgages at reduced rates, forgave 3 months of payments association-wide while the reserve fund was rebuilt, and covered Sablatura's ramp citation personally, in cash, out of my own pocket, the same week the charges against Denise were filed. At the next election, Comfort Creek Estates elected a new HOA president, Dorothy Sablatura, 78 years old, oxygen tank rolling beside her podium, sworn in to applause that lasted longer than any speech she gave. I still eat breakfast at my great-grandfather's table every morning. The orchard smells like turned soil this time of year, rain coming in from the west, and the 3 trees over the family plot are heavier with pecans than they've been in a decade. Here's what I learned, and what I'd tell anyone sitting where I once sat. Keep every document, even the ones that seem too small to matter. Silence isn't weakness, it's a place to load your evidence. And the people who wave the most paper in your face are usually the ones most afraid of what real paper can do. Dot still visits some Sundays, oxygen tank and all, bringing peach preserves she makes herself. Last time, she mentioned that a developer's been circling her late husband's old fishing land 2 counties over, offering a fair price to some very tired heirs who don't know what she and I know about paperwork. I told her to bring me the file.